All right, our group was talking about anti-fraud policy and prosecution, so by far the most interesting and fun of the workshops. Basically, through the presentations and through the panel that happened afterwards, there were a few themes, obviously, that came up talking about what we'd heard in the morning, a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same even solutions. Some of them, of course, networking, especially informal networks to share information. Sharing information came up a lot. And out of all of the sharing information that I've heard so far, I haven't really heard a very specific solution, except maybe for something like Cybercrime Exchange, and that's a technical solution. So there's this, at least my perception so far, I don't know if the panelists also thought so, but a little bit fuzzy on what sharing information means, and that's probably because there's so many different stakeholders, each with their own individual information and mechanisms for sharing. So I think that, even though we're saying it a lot, I'm not completely sure what that means in many contexts. The next thing that, this has come up several times as well, those that make profit in this entire ecosystem have some role to play. So especially banks get a bad rap, but a lot of other groups are making profit in the ecosystem as well, where they could potentially be doing more to respond to this. So wherever there's profit, there's potential for holding that group a little bit more responsible, or we should be holding them potentially a little bit more responsible, because those profit sources eventually are coming out of crime, right? So proceeds of crime, we already hold liable. We're not necessarily doing that in the entire ecosystem, right? We're focusing on very specific groups. Try to work together, and then if that doesn't work, exert political influence. Basically, it was put in a very elegant way. I won't talk about it here, but basically, trying to make partnerships with people and then looking at regulation. Because if a group is willing to work on the problem themselves because of their own motivation, you're more likely to get a positive output. And then whenever that doesn't work, then looking at the regulation to try to force changes where they need to be forced. Now, this is also very national, and a lot of the discussion that we've had is also either very national focused or European focused. I didn't see a lot outside of kind of the European context, of course, because it's the European conference. But we're really looking at kind of a global response to this. Otherwise, if you forget half of the world, you're going to have problems in half of the world, right? So don't forget, I guess, everywhere else. But a lot of it was trying to work together, exerting political influence, and most of that was in the local context. So those are the things that I heard basically from the morning that were kind of also reflected in the discussions that we had. Some things that were a little bit unique. First off, be intentional with data collection. We have a lot of data feeds coming in. We have a lot of threat actors we can look at. We have so much information. What do we do with it all? Right? So actually designing properly why and how we're going to collect information, and especially asking people for information. Why are we doing that? Why are we wasting people's time? Can we actually use that to make better decisions? Right, so that, I think, was an excellent point. Be intentional with your data collection. Make sure you know why you're asking for that information. More cooperation in the ecosystem. So we've seen a little bit about mapping out the entire ecosystem of kind of these fraud networks or the different actors that are involved in them. And then looking at how we can do better cooperation within those different chains. Getting regulators together in cross-sectional discussions, so putting regulators in a room a lot more often. I can tell you I do this a lot in Southeast Asia, and it is extremely effective because some of these regulators have never talked to each other, and they've never heard about the problem of scams. They've received it on their phone, but they've never discussed it, right? So definitely just getting regulators in the room and then talking about these new ideas really does make a major impact. And although it sounds super basic, it seems to not be happening enough. So if you really want to make policy differences, there you go. And then public-private partnership that works locally. A lot of times, especially obviously in the European context, GDPR was brought up a lot, which I thought was interesting. It was brought up negatively. Which was kind of shocking to me. I mean, I'm not European, I don't necessarily work in this kind of economy, but almost every time GDP was brought up, it was brought up as a hindrance to the problem. So this was something, talking about public-private partnerships, and a lot of people were talking about how to get around GDPR so they can do public-private partnerships. Now, I don't know, this is just my observation, I could be totally wrong, but this is kind of the feeling that I get from a lot of the discussions that we had. Yes, yep, okay. And then one final thing that I want to talk about, again, there was a big focus on European kind of perspective, but scams, scam perception as a culture. So really seeing the reason and the motivations for scam as a cultural phenomena, not just a financial motivation. So whenever we look at different cultures, even within the EU, but even outside the EU, cultures have different reasons for doing what they're doing. And whenever we try to box everything in with, let's say, one type of legislation, if you're not thinking about the culture, you're not going to make underlying changes to that system. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.